Hemoglobin is by far the most common component of a red blood cell. It's a protein that's inside the red blood cell, and its job is to bind to oxygen and carbon dioxide. So when we say red blood cells, one of their roles is to carry the oxygen. The reason why it can carry the oxygen is because it has this hemoglobin protein which physically binds to the oxygen. Now, when hemoglobin is actually bound to oxygen, it turns a nice bright red color, and that's what makes the red blood cells red, and your overall blood red. Now, if you look into one hemoglobin, each red blood cell actually has about 250 million hemoglobins, but if you look at just one hemoglobin has 4 chains of amino acids. So here, for instance, this is one alpha chain. Here's another alpha chain, here's a beta chain, and here's a second beta chain. The names aren't so important, but again, there's just 4 chains. And each one of the chains has its own heme and own iron. Now, you might know that iron is an extremely important part of your diet. And the reason is because it's absolutely necessary as part of a hemoglobin in your red blood cells in order to bind the oxygen. So there's actually a certain type of anemia, which is a lack of red blood cells, that's due to iron deficiency. We'll discuss more about anemias at the end of the red blood cell section. So again, hemoglobin is the main component of your erythrocytes. It makes up about 97% of your entire erythrocyte, and its job is to bind iron. Now let's look at the structure of an erythrocyte. The structure is called a flexible biconcave shape disc. So let's break this down. So disc, think of it as like your old CD, right? So very circular and flat. Biconcave. Concave is this little dip that you see right here. So concave is a downward dip. And bi means 2. So you'll see on both sides of the red blood cell, there's a dip on the top and a dip on the bottom. Flexible means that the red blood cell actually bends a lot. And here's why all of these features are important. Remember, red blood cells have to go through very narrow blood vessels, and sometimes these blood vessels aren't even as wide as the blood cell. So the blood cells actually need to be able to fold up to squeeze its way past those tight blood vessel corners. And the flexible biconcave shape allows it to do that. Now, the reason why it has to go through all of those blood vessels and into such tiny spaces is because the function, remember, is to transport respiratory gases, mainly oxygen and carbon dioxide. Another interesting thing to know about erythrocytes is that it has a lifespan of about 100 to 120 days in circulation. And here's why it only lasts about 3 to 4 months tops. It's because the red blood cell actually has no nucleus. If you remember the blood smear I just showed you, I pointed out the purple nuclei and the white blood cells, but notice the red blood cells were basically empty inside. So let's try and figure out an explanation as to why the red blood cell would have no nuclei. Let me give you a story that I thought of. So I've got this nephew and he loves donuts. So think about this. If I gave my nephew a dozen donuts in a bag and I told him to deliver those donuts to the neighbor who lives a block away, and he agreed to do so because he has no choice, he takes the bag and he starts to walk down the street. Now, of course, he's a kid, so he doesn't have much control. He looks into the bag and he sees his favorite donut on the top. What's he probably going to do? He'll probably eat it, right? And then below that first donut, he sees his second favorite donut, and he eats that one too. And this goes on until he finally gets to the neighbor's house to deliver the donut. And do you think all 12 donuts are still there? Probably not. In fact, knowing him, might be down to like 5, maybe 4. So you see where the problem is. My nephew's job was to deliver the donuts, but he also likes to eat them, so he eats the donut. Therefore, he's eaten up some of the stuff he needs to deliver. It's the same thing with the red blood cells. Think about what the nucleus does. It's the control center. Now think about what the control center needs to work. Do you think it needs a lot of energy to run the control center? Absolutely. So the nucleus will need a lot of energy to work. How does it get its energy? Remember, your body gets its energy from, yes, eating food and getting the carbohydrates, but also using oxygen to convert those carbs into ATP, which is the energy your body can use. So if a red blood cell had a nucleus, it would require a lot of energy. It would use a lot of oxygen to create that energy. And if the red blood cell uses all of the oxygen for its nucleus, it won't have any oxygen left to deliver to its final destination. So that's why it's more efficient for red blood cells to actually have no nucleus. They'll have the nucleus when it's young, when it's developing, but the mature red blood cell has no nuclei because it would consume too much oxygen and counteract the actual function of a red blood cell. So if you think about it, red blood cells aren't actually cells. Remember, a cell needs to have three things: a plasma membrane, cytoplasm, and a nucleus. So the fact that we call them red blood cells is actually not correct. But that's the nomenclature or the name that we're used to. All right, the last thing I want to tell you guys about red blood cells are some of the disorders. So let's start off with anemia, which is one I'm sure you all heard of. It literally means lacking blood. And in this particular case, red blood cell. So think about someone you may know who has anemia or what you know about anemia, and think about some of the symptoms of an anemic person. When the person is lacking these red blood cells, they can't carry oxygen, so they'll have an abnormally low carrying oxygen capacity. And some of the symptoms you might see are paleness and lack of energy. The paleness would be because there's no oxygen bound to the iron in the hemoglobin in the red blood cell. Remember, that's what gives blood its bright red color. And blood gives your skin pigmentation. Remember, it's one of the main components that contributes to the color of your skin. So without that redness from the blood, the skin looks pale. Now remember the lack of energy. You need oxygen to convert your carbohydrates you eat into energy the body can use. So without oxygen, you can't get the energy from your food. So therefore, the person has lower energy level. One type of anemia I want to point out to you guys is sickle cell anemia. This is where the red blood cell is actually a sickle shape. So remember I discussed the normal shape of a red blood cell. It should be biconcave and flexible disc-like. Here's a sickle-shaped red blood cell, and notice it's drastically different. And this is actually a genetic disorder. In this genetic disorder, there's a mutation in the gene that codes for the shape of the red blood cell. So think about this sickle shape. Do you think it can go through blood vessels as well? Not really. It tends to get more stuck in those tight corners, making the person more prone to blood clots. In addition, this shape doesn't carry the oxygen as well, so this person will be suffering from low levels of oxygen. Another type of anemia I mentioned earlier was the iron deficiency anemia. So remember, that's when the person doesn't have enough iron, so their hemoglobin can't find the oxygen, again, bringing you back to that low oxygen carrying capacity of the red blood cell, resulting in anemia. Now let me talk about an opposite type of disorder called polycythemia. Poly means multiple. In this case, you have multiple, or you have an excess of red blood cells. You might be thinking at first, well, hey, that's not a bad issue, right? More red blood cells, more oxygen, more energy. Well, here's the problem. When you have too many red blood cells in your blood, the viscosity increases. Viscosity is the thickness of the liquid. So think about, for instance, water has low viscosity. It's not very thick. It's very watery already. Ketchup, on the other hand, has a high viscosity, very thick. It doesn't run as smoothly. So if you put more red blood cells in your blood, the viscosity increases. So if the viscosity increases, do you think the blood's going to flow as well? No. It starts to get caught because it's so thick it doesn't go through the blood vessels, and therefore blood circulation starts to become impaired. And the reason why I put a picture up here of this mountain, this is actually Mount Fuji, is that your body actually gets a temporary form of polycythemia when you go to high altitude. So if you've been to high altitude, you might realize it's a little more difficult to breathe because there's not as much oxygen in the atmosphere the higher up you go. So your body compensates by trying to make more red blood cells, so hopefully to bind to more oxygen since it realizes that you're lacking oxygen. And then, of course, the issue is the blood circulation starts to slow down. But your body is pretty good at adjusting to this. So just going to a high altitude isn't going to give you polycythemia that's going to be deadly. Your body will readjust. Now let me ask you a question. What do you guys think? True or false? If you drain some of your blood, you will produce more red blood cells, which will bind to more oxygen. This is actually true. Your body, again, naturally accommodates. If you drain some of your blood or you lose some of your blood, your body automatically starts to produce more red blood cells. Remember, you produce automatically 2 million a second, but this number will actually increase because your body thinks, hey, I need more red blood cells. I need to bind to more oxygen. And some athletes actually pick up on this trick and use this technique. What they do is they drain some of their blood, which means their body will naturally reproduce that blood. Then they inject the blood that they drained back into their veins and their blood vessels. So now they have more red blood cells, more than the usual 4.3 to 5.2 million per cubic millimeter. And with more red blood cells, they can bind to more oxygen. With more oxygen, they can make more energy and have a higher performance. And that's the theory behind it. And it actually has a name. It's called blood doping. And it's definitely illegal. It's been notified as a source of basically cheating. And so if you look at any worldwide or national competition, blood doping is not allowed. And this picture you might notice here, this is Lance Armstrong. He's been caught before for blood doping and been basically banned from racing. Just to review, the red blood cell, your red blood cell count is 4.3 to 5.2 million red blood cells per cubic millimeter, and the hematocrit should be about 45. And remember, that's 45% of your overall blood. The structure of red blood cells with hemoglobin allow it to function as an oxygen and carbon dioxide transporter. And red blood cell disorders include anemias and polycythemia.